Hello, everyone, and welcome to the International Law and Social Science Spring 2025 Speaker Series, which is co-hosted by the American and European Societies of International Law. My name is Mark Pollack, and I am here today to moderate our final event of the Spring 2025 series, featuring Professor Mara Revkin, who will be presenting a new paper entitled Fate or Choice: Attitudes Towards Collaboration and Reintegration in Ukraine, which she's co-authored with Janina Dill, Marnie Howlett, and Carl Muller-Crepon. As you'll hear, this is an extraordinary piece of theoretically informed empirical scholarship, asking how Ukrainians assess the behavior of their fellow citizens in the war that followed the 2022 Russian invasion of their country. I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, so let me begin with very brief introductions of our speaker and our discussant for today. So first, Mara Revkin is Associate Professor of Law at Duke University with a secondary appointment in Duke's Department of Political Science. Professor Revkin holds a JD from Yale Law School and a PhD in political science from Yale, where her dissertation examined the Islamic State's governance of civilians in Iraq and Syria. Professor Revkin's research and teaching interests are in the area of armed conflict, peace building, and transitional justice, with an empirical focus on the Middle East and Africa. She uses both qualitative and quantitative empirical methods in her research, including surveys, experiments, interviews, archival research, and she's conducted field research in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and South Sudan. In addition to her academic research, she's also worked with and advised UN agencies and other international organizations on the design of evidence-based programs and policies that aim to strengthen the rule of law, support peaceful reconciliation after conflict, and mitigate the root causes of political violence and extremism. So her work really exemplifies how legal and social science approaches can be integrated to understand the dilemmas of accountability and reintegration after conflict. Following Professor Revkin's introduction, we're fortunate to have as our discussant Professor Jeff Dancy, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto and one of the leading scholars in transitional justice, human rights law, and political violence. Professor Dancy's work explores the politics of accountability in post-conflict society, the global spread of transitional justice mechanisms, and the effects of trials, truth commissions, and amnesties on democratic development. He's published on these issues in pretty much every leading journal in both international law and international relations. He's also a principal investigator in the Transitional Justice Evaluation Database and a widely respected contributor to both scholarly debates and policy frameworks around justice and reconciliation. And most relevant to today's talk, he is also the author of a 2023, co-author of a 2023 Foreign Affairs article entitled Russia's Willing Collaborators. Ukraine needs a measured lustration policy to strengthen security and rebuild democracy. He is the perfect discussant for today's talk, and we're grateful to have him here. Okay, so in terms of logistics, I think we've agreed that Mara will present for around 25 minutes, give or take, followed by around 5 to 10 minutes of commentary from Jeff. And after that, we'll be very happy to throw the discussion open to questions from our live audience. So if you are watching live and would like to ask Mara a question, please look at the Q&A function, not the chat function, and simply enter your question there. After Jeff's discussion, I'll moderate these questions from the Q&A, and we'll get through as many as we can during our 1 hour here this morning. So Mara, with no further ado, take it away.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that very generous introduction, and to everyone at ACEL and ECEL for facilitating this series. And Jeff, it's really an honor to have you discuss this work as a leader in the field. I'll say just first, so this is a relatively early stage paper, which is why we didn't pre-circulate the draft to everyone, but I'm very happy to share the draft if you just reach out to me by email after. And really look forward to questions and feedback on this work. Okay, sharing slides. Great. Can everyone see the slides?
Yeah.
Great. So this is a paper that takes on the question of how people in wartime Ukraine judge their fellow citizens in the context of Russian aggression and occupation. Russia's control of substantial territory in Ukraine and its coercion over the civilian population living in those areas has led to large numbers of Ukrainians being suspected or accused of collaborating with the Russian occupation. In this study, we use survey experiments to investigate the micro-level determinants of those judgments. So we're interested in questions of specifically, do Ukrainians care more about traits that are involuntary or fated, as we say in the paper, like one's ethnic identity, or do they care more about the actions that people take and the voluntariness of those actions? So as the title of Jeff's Foreign Affairs article suggests, were people actually willing collaborators? What did they do? A brief outline of what I will cover today, starting with the motivation behind this study and the theories that informed our research questions. Then I'll briefly describe the context of wartime Ukraine with a couple of examples, and then our research design, followed by some key findings from our 2 experiments and some broader implications for our understanding of social cohesion during war, as well as the prospects for eventual post-conflict reintegration and transitional justice. Just to preview a few of what I think are our most interesting findings, we find that voluntary decisions and behavior, particularly acts of resistance and collaboration, are by far the strongest predictors of likelihood of reintegration. And we measure that outcome with willingness to have a potential collaborator or resistor as a neighbor. But we also find that unchosen traits like ethnic identity, as well as involuntary exposure to Russian occupation, so if you just happen to be living in an area occupied by Russia, those traits still create significant barriers to reintegration. So Ukrainians prefer in-group or members of their own in-group ethnic Ukrainians over members of the out-group who are ethnic Russians, such that Ukrainians would still prefer to be neighbors with a passive Ukrainian over an ethnic Russian who resisted. Importantly, we also find that choice and fate interact, seeming to create higher expectations for in-group members and lower expectations for the out-group, which is consistent with theories of in-group policing. So Ukrainians judge other ethnic Ukrainians more harshly than ethnic Russians for the same type of collaboration. So, for example, providing information to Russian forces or even fighting on behalf of Russia. Similarly, they so ethnic Ukrainians reward ethnic Russians who resisted the occupation more than Ukrainians who engaged in the same forms of resistance. But even Russians who resisted the occupation can't overcome the ethnic bias against them, which remains a significant barrier to reintegration. So basically, we find that these two dimensions both matter to varying extents, primarily conduct and choice, the actions that we take, but also who we are, so immutable or inherited identity traits like ethnicity. Getting to our motivation, we know from rich literature on studies of conflict that wars of aggression are extremely polarizing for the affected societies, in part because they force civilians living in occupied territory to make very difficult choices. So do you support your country by resisting the occupation? Do you try to survive by cooperating? Or do you try to keep your head down and just stay neutral? The resulting polarization raises broader questions about the effects of war on social cohesion during and after war, and the prospects for reconciliation and reintegration. So we're interested specifically in our study in questions of where do people draw the line between survival and collaboration? Will people who made different decisions be able to trust each other after the war and live together peacefully, or will we see the kinds of revenge killings and other forms of extrajudicial punishment that have been observed in other contexts, like post-Nazi Europe after World War II, as well as in post-ISIL Iraq, a context that I've studied as well. So getting to the specific questions motivating this paper, we ask whether judgments are driven primarily by an individual's conduct and the voluntariness of that conduct, as moral theories would predict, or instead are they influenced more by unchosen traits like ethnic identity or exposure to occupation, as theories of intergroup bias would predict. A bit of historical context, these are not new questions. As I mentioned, we saw after World War II how harshly communities treated people accused of collaborating with the Nazis. These weren't just through formal punishments like prosecutions, but also public shaming and ostracism. In Ukraine, we're now seeing similar dynamics play out, not only criminal prosecutions of, to date, I think it's more than 8,000 collaborators and counting, but also neighbors turning against each other. And just a couple of examples of evidence of this kind of stigma from Ukraine. On the left here, you see Ukrainians in Kherson being accused of collaborating with Russia. And on the right, you see Ukrainians in Russian-occupied Donetsk, which is one of the historically separatist regions in which the population identifies as historically closer to Russia. There we see Ukrainians being accused of resisting Russia. So our paper engages with an active scholarly debate on the nature of Ukrainian identity. And we focus in particular on two different approaches. There's the traditional view of a country that is deeply divided along ethnic lines, with Ukrainians in the West and Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the East. But there's also a newer theory of civic national identity, which is the idea that anyone can become a citizen of Ukraine by demonstrating loyalty through their actions. And this is an idea that's been promoted quite a bit by current President Zelensky, including with proposed legislation that would provide a citizenship pathway for foreign fighters who support Ukraine's resistance. And in interviews conducted by the paper's Ukraine expert, who I should say is not me, our Ukraine expert is Marnie Howlett, who speaks Ukrainian and has spent a number of years doing fieldwork there. These interviews provided some initial anecdotal evidence that reality is somewhat more complicated than either view, and it falls somewhere in between. So actions matter, but there's also a strong bias against ethnic Russians that persists even for those who support Ukraine. So just reviewing quickly our research questions here. We're interested in whether Ukrainians judge each other primarily based on unchosen traits, so ethnic identity, or based on their choices or actions. And the outcome of interest in this study is reintegration, which we measure by with a survey question that asks respondents about their willingness to allow a hypothetical individual to be their neighbor or to live next door to them. And this is a common measure of reintegration in divided societies and in post-conflict settings where there has been a lot of displacement. So we're often both during and after war dealing with situations where large numbers of people will be displaced and either have to return to their communities or relocate to other areas. And this makes these questions about sort of who is going to be living next door to you after this conflict particularly salient. Okay, so this is the design of our first conjoint experiment that looks at this, that's trying to assess to what extent fate or sort of inherited unchosen traits affect judgments versus behavior and voluntary actions. So in this experiment, and I'm not going to get too deep into the methods of the conjoint, there's a lot more in the paper. I'm happy to say more in Q&A, but this is a type of experiment that randomly varies attributes of a particular hypothetical scenario in order to estimate the independent causal effects of each of these attributes on an outcome of interest, which in our case is likelihood that a hypothetical person will be accepted as a neighbor, a proxy for likelihood of successful reintegration. And so selecting from among the attributes in this table here, the experiment showed people profiles of two different hypothetical neighbors that varied in their ethnic descent, whether or not they lived under Russian occupation in the 3 months prior to their move, and what they did during the war and whether those actions were voluntary or not. And then we asked respondents which of those two hypothetical people they'd be most willing to have as their neighbor. And this allows us to estimate or to see which traits seem to matter most for people's judgments or preferences about who they're willing to have as a neighbor. A little bit about the survey administration. The survey, this is a nationally representative survey that was conducted in partnership with a local Ukrainian research firm with a sample of more than 2,500 respondents in areas controlled by the Ukrainian government. For obvious ethical and security reasons, we excluded areas that were at the time of the survey in April 2024 occupied by Russian forces. And we also, in some of our analysis, overlaid the locations of the respondents who were randomly selected with other data on conflicts of events in order to account for where people were more and less affected by the war. So we can see sort of where respondents were living and what degree of exposure they would have had to various war-related violence and other conflict events. Okay. So as is the standard practice with conjoint experiments, we analyze the data by calculating average marginal component effects using ordinary least squares regression with robust standard errors. And I can say more about this in Q&A, but in short, AMCs are estimates of how much each attribute, like ethnic descent or conduct, affects people's preferences, both individually and in combination with each other. And our primary analysis focuses on the outcome of a forced choice. So which of these two hypothetical neighbors would you prefer? But we also asked respondents to rate the individual neighbors on a Likert scale to get to even more granular data on their preferences. And we include some of that analysis in the appendix. Okay. So this figure, and I apologize, this is showing up a little bit blurry, but I'll talk through the main results here. So starting at the bottom, and we have average marginal component effects on the left, as well as marginal means on the right. And I'll be speaking I'll speak to both of these. So starting at the bottom, conduct is the most important driver of preferences for who your preferences about who you're willing to have as a neighbor. And we see a 50 percentage point difference for those who collaborated with Russia by providing information or fighting. So in the forced choice pairs, this means that collaborators are 37 and 35 percentage points less likely to be chosen as potential neighbors in comparison with those who kept their heads down, which is the language that we use for sort of efforts to stay neutral. In contrast, those who resisted by fighting for Ukraine were selected in 74% of all comparisons and 15 percentage points more often than those who kept their heads down. We also find, just going up in the figure to the rows here for the part of this figure that looks at reluctant and free action. These are our findings on the effects of volition. We find that when actions are voluntary, that strengthens the effect, and when actions are reluctant, that weakens the effect. So it's not only the action that matters, but also the state of mind. We also find evidence of what we call an occupation bias. So people living, so these hypothetical future neighbors who have been living under Ukrainian control, regardless of ethnic identity or conduct, are 13 percentage points more likely to be accepted. Being of Russian descent reduces a potential neighbor's average probability of being chosen by 28 percentage points. And we interpret this as evidence of some pretty strong and persistent anti-Russian bias that does continue to sort of shape preferences despite the primary importance of actions here. We also did, we looked at other identity traits, including age and the effects of gender, and found that these were actually not significant. Men are only slightly less likely to be accepted than women, but that result is not substantively or statistically significant at conventional levels. So moving now to some of our findings on interaction effects, we find that in cases where the hypothetical person is a Russian, they're treated, or they're perceived more negatively across all types of behavior. But Russians are also blamed less than Ukrainians for fighting with Russia. And interestingly, Ukrainians are actually judged more harshly for collaborating with Russia than their ethnically Russian equivalents. And these findings, we think, provide some support for theories of in-group policing, in which people hold members of their own in-group to a higher standard than out-group members. So in this case, Ukrainians seem to expect more of their fellow ethnic Ukrainians, and they punish them more harshly for transgressions. And at the same time, they seem to expect less of Russians, and so they reward them more for positive behavior in terms of supporting Ukraine's resistance against Russia. So just one example here. So Russians who collaborated with Russia are 29 percentage points less likely to be selected than the hypothetical person who kept their head down. But the penalty for Ukrainian collaborators is significantly larger at 41 percentage points. And the positive effect of fighting in support of the Ukrainian resistance is stronger for ethnic Russians by 18 percentage points compared with those of Ukrainian descent. Okay. So I want to go briefly through some of the results for a second conjoint experiment in the paper that we are still in the process of analyzing. The first experiment I just shared was about the outcome of reintegration, and the second experiment focuses on the potential for reintegration. So we're interested in knowing whether if someone has collaborated, can they be redeemed? We tested two potential redemptive mechanisms. The first is punishment. So does criminal punishment so in the form of a prison sentence, make respondents sort of more willing to allow the reintegration of this former collaborator? And second, if that former collaborator apologizes, can that change attitudes? Can that make people more willing to accept them? We find here, interestingly, that the criminal punishment had no effect at all. Even after prison sentences, respondents still didn't want those individuals as neighbors. But apology had a small positive effect. And we are still thinking through these findings, but we think it suggests that restorative justice mechanisms may be more promising in some contexts than criminal punishment for certain types of collaboration. And that's consistent with some findings from one of my previous studies in Iraq with Kristen Gao, where we found that prison sentences similarly had no effect on Iraqis' willingness to allow the return and reintegration of former ISIL collaborators. And here I just want to clarify, we're describing civilians who collaborated with ISIL in roles such as in civilian jobs like being cooks or cleaners or tax collectors, and not former fighters who very much are viewed harshly. But yes, so similarly in Iraq, we found this positive effect, small but significant positive effect of an apology, and as well as also a positive effect in that context of community service, another sort of restorative justice mechanism that focuses more really on community remedies for sort of victims and rebuilding communities than it does on accountability for perpetrators. So together, we think these findings suggest that redemption is very difficult. But there are still some redemptive mechanisms that seem to have positive effects on the margins, like apologies, and these should be explored further. This is just, again, this is a conjoint experiment with a similar design that I won't go through in detail. But I'm happy to say more about any of these results or methods, and happy to share the paper with anyone who's interested. And again, this is early stage draft, and first time presenting this back from parental leave. So I'm going to do my best to answer questions coherently. Really appreciate all of your time, and thanks again to Jeff for reading.
Thank you, Mara. Well, by the way, it does not feel early stage. Having read the paper, it looks very, very polished. But nevertheless, I'm going to try and find some things to say about it. Jeff.
I was going to say the same thing. This is early stages, then about my late stages. But like everything that Mara Revkin's involved with, this paper is well crafted, thorough, sophisticated, and methodologically bulletproof as far as I can tell. The evidence is remarkable, and it provides us with direct insight into the attitudes of sometimes captive and mostly divided population living through a war of aggression. The effort that you must have put into this study is mind-boggling, and it should leave us all impressed. So if you're not impressed, you should be. But I'm not going to talk directly about the evidence from Ukraine, except to say that it dovetails with observed data my team has collected regarding the perception of collaborators in Ukraine. Ukrainians, we found, are quite critical of their own, as you're suggesting here, especially those living in occupied territories. The stigma that attends to just living amid occupation is quite strong. And Ukrainians are also quite desirous of punishment for collaboration among fellow Ukrainians. So in a sense, it's encouraging to see that there's cross-study validity on these questions, though it's discouraging to see that it appears division is strong and growing. I'm also not going to talk extensively about the methodological presentation. I'll leave the discussion of like average marginal component effects to someone else. I think that you've done it well, and all of that's important, but it's not really what interests me the most, and I'm going to discuss it. I'm primarily interested in the theory, so I'd like to just make three total points about the theory. First is stylistic. It's a stylistic comment on the hypotheses. I understand the distinction that's being drawn in the paper between moral and psychological models, and the hypotheses make sense to me. And like I said, they dovetail with what we've discovered with observed data before. But the presentation itself of the hypotheses is a little dizzying, and I'm not sure that tables 1 and 2 help. And so in particular, the footnoted hypotheses under the table combined with the empty cells inside the table made kind of interpreting the tables rather difficult. And so I think I have some ideas for how you might do that differently if we want to go through the nitty-gritty, but I think I would stack the hypotheses and then have them in 2 different sections. But that's that's just a stylistic point. I was confused by those tables. That's all I'm saying. The second is the framing of the empirical theory. I find the framing of morality versus psychology a little strange. Are these really oppositional approaches? For instance, and this is me asking out of ignorance, isn't morality subsumed within psychology, or at least a branch of the discipline that's referred to as moral psychology? I think your study situates well within the subfield of moral psychology, which you could also call a form of political psychology if you wanted to. And I think this would actually pair well with political psychological work. But moral psychology confronts the impact or non-impact that perceptions of choice have on judgments of others' actions. So instead of setting up the theory as morality versus psychology or treating those as 2 different approaches that then map on to choice versus fate, I think it might be better to frame the whole theory as different expectations within moral or political psychology, if that makes sense, where you really focus on the opposition between fate and choice, and then the combination of fate and choice, and really focusing on that rather than setting up as 2 different 2 sets of 2 categories, if that makes sense. Third and most importantly, I think is, and I hope it opens up for more questions, is a bundle of concerns I have about the normative theory that's tacitly applied in the paper. For Mara and her authors, the primary aim for countries at war is to achieve reintegration and social cohesion, and that assumption, and the assumption that populations may reconcile in the future. That assumption is doing a lot of work kind of in the background of the paper, and and it's done so in other work that you've done in Iraq, for example. Social cohesion is undoubtedly a worthwhile goal, and it's something that we want in every society. We would like more social cohesion in the United States, for example. I personally would like it in Louisiana too, where I'm from. But I wonder whether it's too much to ask of a population that's involved in an active conflict, especially given that we know organized violence exerts effects that last for generations to come. So whatever violence is being done today in Ukraine will affect the next generation and then the next generation of people. So in addition to that, we have few concrete examples, I think, I might be wrong, of successful post-conflict reconciliation to point to, or post-conflict redemption. Which post-conflict country should we hold Ukraine up to should we say this is the society you should try to emulate? Would it be Bosnia, Guatemala, Rwanda, Sri Lanka? In all of these places, the divisions that we've seen before are still there. They're just not involved in an active conflict. Additionally, on the very specific point that prosecutions seem not to encourage reintegration or redemption, I suspect I would argue that this is a straw man. And I would submit that the very purpose of prosecutions is not at all reintegration or reconciliation, despite some theories that have suggested otherwise. The point of prosecutions is stigma. And if it's not stigma that you're seeking to create, then you should not pursue criminal punishment. I'm making a big claim here. But the idea that prosecutions may produce reconciliation is one of the worst performing theories of transitional justice. And I think it's been disconfirmed repeatedly for the last 25 years. So I wonder if this is what we should be evaluating with good and nuanced work like you've done. Finally, I think the international community has repeatedly had to learn the lesson that ethnicity or nationality or inherited traits are immutable or politically sticky. And I wonder what the implication of that is as we move forward, especially in a context like Ukraine. Could ethnic Russians or perceived separatists from the East ever be incorporated into the Ukrainian nation moving forward? And if not, does that mean that something like partition is inevitable? That's where I'll leave it, because I think I'll just say at the end, a lot of people assume, because some of us, we work on transitional justice, that we're hopeful about the possibility of reconciliation. But for me, it's quite the opposite. I'm down on reconciliation. I don't think that reconciliation happens. I'd happy to be proved otherwise. But that's, I think, the kind of elephant in the room for the work that you're doing in this paper, and in something I've always wanted to talk to you about. So that's why I'm raising the issue here. Thank you.
Okay, Mara, I'm going to suggest, since actually you were both incredibly efficient in terms of time, and since Jeff raised some really fundamental points, why don't we let you respond to Jeff for a few minutes? You can pick and choose what you think is most important. We have some questions already from Larry Helfer and Ezgi Yildiz and Anna Fanakin, who are in the audience. So let's balance, your immediate response with letting them in.
Thank you so much, Jeff. These are incredibly generous and helpful comments, and raise a lot of things that sort of we've been struggling with as the co-authors, but haven't made it into the paper yet. So I guess maybe going somewhat in reverse order, I definitely share your critique of prosecutions not actually serving any kind of a restorative or rehabilitative purpose in these contexts. And so I think, to some extent, this finding was expected, or it's not unexpected, given what we know about the long-term stigmatizing effects of incarceration. But I think we need to do more about framing it as evidence or supporting those critiques of traditional criminal justice responses to at least forms of sort of nonviolent collaboration, or some of these types of conduct that are really that are perceived, yes, that sort of make it difficult for people to live together after conflict. And I think, so I would say too that we tried to get around I did a similar experiment in Iraq, where we found that similarly that these prison sentences had no effect, and we thought it might have been because of the negative signaling effect of a prison sentence on trust, and sort of having regardless of what someone did, knowing that they've been sentenced to prison for 15 years has all kinds of kind of negative effects on the likelihood that you might want them to be a neighbor, including not just what they did to get into prison, even if they were innocent, but maybe during prison they've been exposed to other criminals. Even if you believe they're totally innocent, just the experience specifically for this reintegration outcome, where we're talking mostly about social trust, but there's a whole other literature on economic reintegration about the ability of these sort of former offenders to get jobs and things like that. And so just having a prison sentence is going to be a barrier to to employment, education, all of these other things that maybe would be desirable in neighbors. So that is definitely, I think, something that we should say more about. I really appreciate your point about some of the normative implications here. This sort of idea, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this too, and I think we might be somewhat on the same page based on your question, but sort of the assumption that underlies a lot of the transitional justice and peace building industry, that if we just sort of design the right interventions, and if we get people to sort of play enough soccer games together and do all of these, and sit in peace circles and all of that, we can eventually achieve forgiveness. And I completely agree with you that there are some really hard limits to these kinds of interventions, particularly in post-atrocity contexts. So after post-genocidal contexts, or in cases where we have extremely identitarian conflicts that with particular forms of violence, also including sexual violence. So some of the things, so the experience of the Yazidi community in Iraq, I think, is a really great example of this, where no number of sort of incentives or inducements or sort of encouragements to forgive that have been tried by various sort of interveners have been made Yazidis sort of any more willing to allow the reintegration of sort of Sunni Arab civilians who are perceived as having collaborated. And to some extent, so I think if we really take seriously the prescriptive goal of sort of victim-centered justice, or at least respecting the agency of populations affected by conflicts, then we need to take seriously when these victimized individuals say they are unwilling to forgive. And so I do think it's a really hard question that I'm struggling with, to where is the line between sort of appropriate encouragement, how much as sort of social scientists and people working on programming and policy in these areas, is it even appropriate to try to sort of encourage forgiveness in contexts where we also want to acknowledge that victims have the right to not forgive. So that's something I think a lot about. I also just think there's more we could do. This is one of the limitations of survey experiments, where ultimately the outcome we're looking at here, reintegration, is pretty limited. It's capturing sort of willingness to live next door to each other, and there are other outcomes that are perhaps even more important. So whether you'd be willing to let your children be friends with children of someone else, or whether you would be comfortable hiring someone with a particular history or identity. So there's more. I've done a little bit more of that in Iraq, but I definitely, it's one of the things that I also, this is why I like mixed methods work, that came out more in qualitative interviews, but we just the caveat to this experiment is that we're looking at sort of a very thin measure. Also agree with some of the, so I'm really happy to hear you say that despite all of your knowledge of this field, the presentation of the hypotheses was still not crystal clear to you, because coming back to this paper after a long break, I also find the table and all of the discussion of hypotheses sort of unnecessarily complex. And I'm wondering if, although we want to be transparent as good social scientists about what we tested and sort of what we found, I don't think we necessarily need to include all of the hypotheses in the main paper, and some of those could maybe be relegated to the appendix. So I think, I guess, to your last question, just about the stickiness of ethnic identity and how this remains a barrier, the implications of that. So to your question, could ethnic Russians ever be incorporated into the Ukrainian nation moving forward? I think one factor there is sort of time elapsed since the end of the conflict, and also kind of the nature of the eventual conflict resolution, whether it's perceived as having been sort of a complete, or partial defeat for Ukraine. But also, I think the results suggest that redemption or kind of reintegration is possible, but those who our outgroup members have to work even harder to benefit from the same sort of, to achieve the same level of redemption. So this reminds me a little bit of studies in the United States about, there have been some studies finding that sort of judges who belong to minority groups or are women are sort of more sensitive to kind of discipline, or more sensitive to sanctions than non-minority judges. And they're also, all of these concerns about minority groups needing to sort of work harder than non-minority peers to prove themselves. And I think that's probably a dynamic that we would find in Ukraine as well. And thank you again for those really excellent questions and comments. And I'll stop there.
Terrific, Mara. That's fabulous. I will abuse my chair's privilege and say that I don't think you should get rid of the reporting on any of your hypotheses, because I think they are a nice cluster. They go together. But I agree with Jeff about the tables. I was wondering if maybe simply a row of a row in that table about interaction effects might be more user-friendly, but you've got plenty of time to think about that. Okay, I have, as I said, a bunch of questions, so I'm gonna suppress my own questions for you, Mara, and go straight to the audience. And some of them overlap in ways which I think will be helpful. And we have almost 20 minutes for this. So I'm going to propose that I just pose a question, you answer it, pose another one, rather than grouping them. So Larry Helfer has three great questions, and I'm going to start with the first one, which is living under occupation indeed a fated trait, a fixed characteristic? So you explain on page 7 that Ukrainians from eastern regions closest to Russia who moved west to escape occupation. So if one can escape occupation altogether, does that affect your findings, or does that affect how we think about the way Ukrainians judge people who lived under occupation?
Thank you, Larry. These are all great questions. I'll get back to you about the others too, but I think you're right. We are making a pretty strong assumption there that people perceive. So in our minds, we're trying to sort of evoke a scenario in which people just happen to be born in or living in an area that is occupied by Russia, and they didn't have any say about their exposure to occupation, but that's not necessarily always the case. So we know that in Iraq, there is sort of sorting, and there's a lot of mobility in conflicts like this, and it's very possible that ethnic Russians are actually migrating to Russian-controlled areas and might have made sort of affirmative voluntary decisions to be exposed to the occupation. And so I think that is something we do have some actually questions about the respondents' displacement history that would help us sort of understand a little bit the actual empirically sort of try to construct people's migration histories and to what extent this to sort of deal with this better. But I think you're right that that is definitely an assumption that could be questioned, and one that we should try to support better in the paper.
Okay, terrific. Now, Larry also has a second question, which I sort of take to be an external validity question, and it echoes one of Jeff's points. And so Larry asks, do you expect these findings to hold once the conflict has concluded, or is there something distinctive about analyzing these issues during an armed conflict? Yeah, I have no idea what the answer to that is. What's your take?
Yeah, another great question. So we had sort of two priors or two kind of sort of rival expectations about how conditions of active conflict might affect attitudes. So the first is that we would expect kind of a hardening of ethnic division. So the more reason during an active conflict, all the more reason to sort of amplify distrust and be sort of extra suspicious of members in the outgroup. But on the other hand, conditions of armed conflict might create sort of instrumental or strategic pressures that actually favor kind of incorporate being more inclusive and incorporating sort of more outgroup members into a nation, sort of if they are if they want to be a part of it. So those are sort of two. I think we find much more support for the first of those expectations, that we see there appears to really be sort of a hardening of well, I guess I wouldn't say clearly. I mean, I think we also find some support the fact that that Russians who do participate in resistance can be redeemed or are perceived at all favorably as evidence. I would say that what we really need to get at this question is longitudinal surveys at different points in time, and that's something that hopefully I'd love to confer, Jeff, with you and your team, because I know that you're also doing surveys and at some different points in time where I think even if we're not asking the exact same questions of the same respondents, we can draw some conclusions about differences in attitudes after some time has elapsed. I will say that in Iraq, I did a survey in January there following up on some issues that I last studied in 2018. So about 8 years later, that's 8 years of, hopefully sort of cooling off period after ISIL's military defeat. And there did seem to be, at least in some indicators, kind of more, at least sort of preferences for retribution and revenge were not as strong as they had been in the immediate aftermath of the conflict. So that's some suggestive evidence that these questions could be answered differently, sort of 5 years post-conflict or 10 years post-conflict, and to really be able to make evidence-based claims about sort of the effectiveness of any of these transitional justice mechanisms, I think we need to be measuring outcomes repeatedly over time.
Okay, terrific. So I have basically, I think Larry's third question and Anna's question overlap, and they're about other possible influences on attitudes. So Anna says, thanks for a super interesting paper. And the question, was there any control for religiosity, and or could one see whether world values surveys, has any influence? And Larry says, in future research, consider correlating responses by whether the person surveyed or interviewed has other beliefs that would dovetail more or less with acceptance of individuals of different ethnicities. This could include views of LGBT persons, views about joining NATO, views about joining the EU, and so on. So I take both of these questions to be what else might influence these attitudes, and can you sort of control for those with the data you have?
Sorry,
Oh,
these are excellent questions again, and actually, I do have conditional on the grant not disappearing. We'll be running another survey in Ukraine in about a year, where we could actually follow up on some of these things. So we do not have a question about religiosity. I do believe that we have a question just about religious identity, and we control for that. But you're right that religiosity is sort of a separate measure that is very relevant for willingness to forgive and sort of beliefs about redemption. So that is definitely something. I will need to go back and check our questionnaire. If we didn't do it this time, we definitely should in the next round. And agree also that some of the other, since this is a nationally representative survey that covered all sort of non-occupied parts of Ukraine, we could also, if there's a world values survey that was conducted sort of around the same time in the same locations, it wouldn't be sort of perfectly comparable or the same, but sort of within some margin of error, we could potentially look at some different sort of attitudinal measures there. I would need to sort of know a bit more about the locations of that survey. To Larry's third question about sort of other beliefs, we unfortunately, the ones that you suggest, sort of views on joining NATO, integrating with the EU are excellent, and unfortunately we didn't ask those. We did have a couple of general questions about how trusting are you of neighbors, and also kind of how much do you interact with your neighbors on a day-to-day basis. So some of these other sort of more objective behavioral, quasi-behavioral measures of social cohesion. But unfortunately, we do not have some of these other, and that was in part just a decision to try to keep the survey to a manageable length and avoid survey fatigue. But that is something we should definitely consider doing in this survey that I hope to be running again next year.
Okay, terrific. And so finally, we have two questions from Ezgi Yildiz, which overlap strongly with the two questions that I had for you, Mara. So the first one basically has to do with the low percentage of respondents identifying as ethnically Russian. And so basically, we're looking at about 4% identify as ethnically Russian, which gives us an N of 105, as Ezgi points out. I would add to Ezgi's question the interesting phenomenon that you don't comment on in the paper, which is only 4% identify as ethnically Russian, but 20% take the survey in Russian. And I wasn't sure how we should interpret that. Or, do we have ethnic Russians who don't want to identify as such? Obviously there's no way you would know that, but yeah. So how do you deal with the ethnic Russians in the survey? They're only a small percentage, but obviously we're interested in what they have to say.
So these are great questions. Would you mind just repeating the last about the difference between those who identify as ethnically Russian and answering the survey? Just the figures there.
Yeah. So the figure of those who identify as ethnically Russian is 4%,
yeah.
But 20% of the respondents chose to take the survey in Russian. Obviously, there might be ethnic Ukrainians who are more confident in the Russian language, but I just wasn't sure if we should read anything into that.
Yeah, so this is a great, this makes me realize this is something I need to talk more to Marty, our Ukraine expert, about, because I do think that gap between the percentage who identify as ethnically Russian and those willing to speak Russian suggests that there might be some social desirability bias that's depressing or kind of leading to underreporting of ethnic Russian identity, because this survey was only conducted in Ukrainian government-controlled areas, and given the biases that we document, there are reasons why people wouldn't want to perhaps identify as ethnically Russian on this survey. So I think actually, I can't remember if we also tested this using language as sort of the proxy for identity. I think we did, and that the results did not differ, but I need to confirm that. But that's a really important point that I will go back to my co-authors on. And about the low percentage, yes, so that could help to explain. It's possible that actually the percentage of ethnic Russians in our sample is larger than we have documented due to social desirability bias. But it's also just possible it's small because I should just reiterate that this the perspective missing, because we excluded Russian occupied areas, we're really missing the perspective of people living under occupation, and those are also the predominantly the areas where the most sort of ethnic Russians live. So I think we probably just, so I'll say that I don't think that is necessarily problematic for results as long as we're really clear about our sample. And I think we are probably, I think we need to be a lot clearer that that is unfortunately how these results might differ if we had the opportunity to survey more ethnic Russians in Russian occupied areas. Those results might very well be different, but that's just a question that's sort of beyond our reach for ethical reasons of not being sort of able to conduct surveys safely or ethically in occupied areas. But that is definitely a real limitation, and it's something that could be studied better in the future if Ukraine were to retake control of some of the currently occupied areas. And that's essentially what happened in Iraq. And I was able to use that to sort of to study, to get data on populations that had experienced occupation more directly. So yeah, I think that's actually that's an important scope condition for the findings that we should make clearer. Sorry, did I answer all the, did I miss a question there?
No, you got it all. And so Ezgi's last question, again, dovetails with mine. She talks about the finding about apologies being more effective than criminal punishment is fascinating, and asks what it expects, leads us to expect about post-conflict justice in Ukraine. I want to ask you a related question, which is right now, the paper really focuses primarily on the theoretical framework, the setup of the experiment, and the results. And there isn't a final policy implications section right now. And maybe it's too soon because you're still analyzing the data. But if you had to write a section like that right now, what do you think your findings so far suggest about post-conflict reconciliation mechanisms?
Yeah, so I think we've also, I think we were cautious about making strong policy recommendations because it's such a rapidly evolving conflict. But I do think that the fact that we find no effective prison sentences it supports other work and I and others have done in Iraq that sort of calling into question the focus on allocating resources for punishment of perpetrators in post-conflict situations. So I think we really need to rethink, given sort of finite resources, personnel, all of these different mechanisms take political will and resources to create. Are we just focusing too much on punishment of perpetrators when maybe victims actually would prefer that resources be allocated to remedies, things like compensation that more directly address their needs, reconstruction of areas that have been damaged, or things that get at moral injuries like apologies. And so I think I'm very much, I believe we need to sort of think more about those findings in the Ukraine context, and also what is even a realistic policy implication or recommendation to make given the current dynamics of the war. But I definitely, this has been sort of a theme in some of my other work in Iraq, that I think we are overestimating, policymakers are either overestimating public demand for harsh punishments, or they are just actually not listening to preferences, because people seem to have preferences for more restorative and sort of victim focused responses and mechanisms. I think we didn't ask about community service in this experiment, which I did in Iraq previously, and that was another one that also had sort of a positive effect. And you could imagine thinking about sort of the mechanisms through which that works. having to do community service, interacting with members of sort of a community that's been victimized, is a way of sort of building trust face to face. And I think there is, back to Jeff's point about incarceration really resulting in sort of long-term stigmatization and social death. It's not something that you would do to a person if you wanted to kind of signal to the community that this is a person who's sort of capable of successfully reintegrating into the population.
Okay, terrific. So I thought we were wrapping up, but two great questions just popped in to the queue. So I'm going to group them for you, Mara, and you'll have about, a couple minutes to respond to them. So the first one comes from Simon Slivansky, and he asks, do you expect any reconciliation process initiated by Moscow in the occupied territories between the ethnic Ukrainians living there and newly arrived Russians? Also, do you think there will need to be some kind of reconciliation process between the Ukrainian men who left the country to avoid having to serve in the armed forces? Those are a little bit speculative, but I think interesting. And then the second question from Arpit Patel is, can punitive laws against collaboration be reconciled with international humanitarian law? So big questions there. I would say, pick and choose what you want to say about each.
Yeah, so really great questions again. On the first about sort of potential for a reconciliation process initiated by Moscow, that I'm just going to say, I think we don't have enough information about different policy proposals but I suspect that something like that, based on other surveys that have been done, showing that a substantial majority of Ukrainians are extremely opposed to yielding territory or making territorial concessions overall, that any kind of process that is run or initiated by Russia is going to be perceived as unjust. But as to whether or not, yes, I think this is extremely important about sort of potential stigma or attitudes towards Ukrainian men who left to avoid military service. And if kind of a demographic feature of our sample is that it is slightly skewed majority women. I think it's 45% men, 55% women. We think that just reflects a significant outmigration of men who left to avoid the draft. And so I think this is definitely a really important question, how people feel about stayers versus leavers. There's both, stayers, it cuts both ways because people who didn't leave are potentially collaborators, but they're also potentially resistors, whereas people who left, at least in the Iraq context, empirically, those tended to be sort of wealthier people with more access to information who had sort of the means to leave ISIL-occupied areas. And there does tend to be both those people, because they didn't experience occupation, are often sort of more judgmental, and kind of the people who left don't have as much empathy with sort of collaborators who were collaborating for reasons of survival, but they also are often not, they're resented by the populations who stayed. So that's something we didn't do in the survey, but very much should consider doing in the next one. And to Arpit's question, this is great. So can punitive laws against collaborators be reconciled with international humanitarian law? I tend to think of this more that the relevant sort of standards or frameworks more in terms of domestic criminal law and international human rights law. So we know that collective punishment is against a lot of different international human rights principles and standards. And nonetheless, that is what we see with a lot of these collaboration laws, including Ukraine's, which define collaboration really broadly in ways that don't really differentiate sufficiently between degrees of collaboration and also sort of voluntariness. Some of these sort of what would be mitigating circumstances about state of mind, sort of duress, coercion. And so there's already been a lot of fair critiques, I think, of these Ukraine's collaboration laws and also those that have been enacted in Iraq. And I think, in order to make those laws to be reconciled with international law, that would require things. So Iraq's laws at least have the death penalty. That's obviously inconsistent with international law. But I think we would also need to see much clearer prioritization and differentiation between treatment of different types of conduct, such that people are really being sort of held criminally responsible only for their individual acts and not responsible for what we would call sort of membership in a status group, or the status of having been perceived as a collaborator without sort of evidence of actual criminal acts. So those were, I'm not sure I got everything exactly, but would really be very, very happy to follow up with anyone by email and share the draft as well. And thank you all. These questions are incredibly helpful. And thanks again, Mark and Jeff, for reading and facilitating. I really appreciate it.
Okay, terrific. I'm inclined to say it's perfect timing because it's 11 o'clock, although we could clearly go for another half hour easily. But I will thank you both. Mara, this is great research. Jeff, those were amazing comments. I hope you two will continue offline. In the meantime, this is our last ASIL/ESIL social science event for spring of 25, but we will return in the fall with a new set of speakers starting in September. And my colleague Anna Fanakin will host and organize that event. So please look out for that over the summer. And thank you all very much. Have a good day.